I haven't been to a nightclub in over 5 years, and I haven't thought about the dynamics of male-female relationships in nightclubs in at least a decade. I also agree with you that nightclubs are ridiculous. Before you enter a nightclub, there's usually a long lineup outside, but when you finally get inside, it's usually empty. And the idea is for the owners, promoters, and bouncers to create the illusion of artificial scarcity and to create the impression that once you get inside, there are tons of people having a great time. And on the outside of the club, there are tons of people clamoring to get in. These lineups are there, in the first place, because that's what's necessary for the clubs to be successful. Now that winter is here, our club district, you see hundreds of women braving the cold weather and wearing only short miniskirts and ultra-high heels to get into those clubs. Honestly, I never thought about it this deeply. I always saw these women literally freezing their asses and just thought to myself, and here's what the Huffington Post says about this particular matter. Flats may be all the rage these days, but a provocative new study from France suggests that high heels do a better job of helping women get what they want from men. In one study, a woman stood on the street and asked pedestrians to complete a survey. When the woman was wearing flat shoes, 25 of the 60 men who approached her, or 42%, agreed to stop and take the survey. However, when the woman wore 2-inch wheels, 36% of the 6 men agreed to take the same survey. And the number of men who scored 49 or higher on the test spiked to 49 out of 60 men, or approximately 82%, when women wore 4-inch heels. And I'm adding a link to that article in the description as well. And now I think high heels are the worst, because they subconsciously change our behavior to be more helpful to women. In doing so, a man is more likely to become a mangina. But if a man is still one of those 18% men who aren't very helpful to women when they're wearing those high heels, then that man basically passes the shit test. Next time you see a woman in high-heeled shoes lined up outside of a club or inside of a club, know that those shoes will make 82% of men more helpful for that woman. And more helpful, it's probably to make us more helpful and buy them drinks, or cover the bill for food or bottle service. But isn't this ironic? Ironic given the fact that you just said you don't believe in irony. Since high heels are supposed to be a symbol of oppressive patriarchy, at the same time, they are also not appropriate for everyday wear. How can high heel shoes that manipulate men to be more giving to women be considered oppressive? What is your reasoning for believing that women are particularly fascinated by shoes? They often have a lot of pairs of shoes because of the power that those shoes give them over men. And now a scientific research article mentioned in the Huffington Post article that I read you also talk about it. In fact, I could make a whole video about women's shoes, and maybe I will in the future. However, I believe the issue of shoes goes further than just spending money on them unnecessarily. This is usually how men see it. I believe that power and status are important factors when it comes to clubbing for both men and women. I remember my last club experience where I went out with women wearing flat-heeled shoes and pants instead of high-heeled shoes and miniskirts, and they were repeatedly rejected by the bouncers. Higher heels make women look more vulnerable outside of the club, and so bouncers are more likely to let them in because they instinctively feel protective of them. The same goes for women who are dressed provocatively standing outside of a club when it's 20 degrees outside. A rational woman wouldn't be doing this unless it serves her best interests. Dressing like sluts and going to a club makes women look vulnerable, and thus draws men's attention as they walk past the club. Since that is the case, they are more likely to join that club themselves, as their instinct is to protect the poor women shivering together, standing naked in the street in their 4-inch heels. Once they get into the club, they are more likely to buy drinks for themselves as well as for the others, to warm them up. So you see, the decision to buy a woman a drink in a bar or club begins long before you step foot in that club. Women are using their charms to seduce men for their resources outside of nightclubs. When the man and woman get inside, the man's feelings of sympathy will have already been stirred and stimulated. As such, he is more likely to give her what she wants. When I first started going out to nightclubs, I was 15 years old and started going to all ages events. Alcoholic beverages are not served at these events unless you are over 19 years old. These nightclubs were filled with guys ranging in age from 14 to their late 20s. Most of the girls in these nightclubs were 14 to 18 years old. Remember when the legal age for consent in Canada was 14? So you could be a middle to late guy picking up 14 or 15-year-olds to sleep over, and that would have been perfectly legal in this country back then. However, today the age of consent has been raised to 16. I didn't realize it growing up, but when I was in my early 20s I stopped caring about club culture. What I could have been doing in my 20s was going to all ages clubs and getting together with teenage girls who hadn't been drinking for many years to speak of. A large number of those girls were still very young and naive, and likely to be as nice as they would ever be with regard to their physical and mental states. I decided to get into relationships instead of playing the field. The myth that 18 was the legal age of consent in Canada was very common back then, because we grew up watching American movies where older men went to jail with girls under 18. They should have taught us this in sex education when we were in high school. However, when I was in my early 20s, clubs lost their appeal for me because girls tended to expect guys to buy them drinks. Because if a guy didn't, then older guys would, and this would essentially mean that I would be spending the night alone. Once women begin to see men as sources of alcohol and resources, the club environment ceases to be one of equality and instead becomes one in which women exploit men. A large number of those girls were still very young and naive, and likely to be as nice as they would ever be with regard to their physical and mental states. These types of things would never happen in Canada. Canadian girls seem to be very stuck up for this, and I think the clubs can often be a lot off-putting until you're in your early to mid-20s. After that, they are a waste of time. But for God's sake, don't go out clubbing to find a girlfriend. When women go to clubs or use bouncers and men to buy their drinks, do you really think they won't use you at the first opportunity when they date them? A lot of my friends when they were younger used to date girls they met at clubs, but it always ended badly. If you're thinking of starting your own club or promoting an existing one, be careful. I was young and unsuccessful when it came to promoting clubs, and the only way I ever managed to break even was if I was selling drugs to club patrons. Clubs are not like casinos where the house always wins. Instead, the winner of the club is always the woman, and everyone else seems to lose or break even.